you know, when we look at these updates that you've given us, and we compare it to, you know, figures like what we see from the Bureau of Statistics that still says 28 million Nigerians lack access to decent and affordable housing. And the recommendation by the Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria is that in order to tackle this, we need to see more collaborative measures, because it would actually cost 21 trillion to, you know, to fill out that housing gap. So can you tell us about collaborative efforts that you've made, or the groundwork that you've done to ensure that, you know, that what you've put on ground so far can be worked on or built on?
Let me start first from the figure of 28 million people that you quote and attribute to the MBS. And I would be surprised if the MBS claims that figure. Because when I took office, I was saddled with a publicly touted 17 million housing deficit. And I said to myself, I think it is important before you embark on this journey to understand how those figures were arrived at. Because if the nation has 17 million housing deficit, it presupposes that you have to build 17 million houses. That is a cure to a proper diagnosis. And nobody could provide an answer to how that figure was arrived at. But I was determined. They first told me it was the World Bank. The World Bank denied it. They told me it was African Development Bank. African Development Bank disclaimed it. I asked the MBS, Dr. Kale, at the time, said no, that it wasn't their figure, and that he even had doubts about the authenticity of the figure. I finally found the figure. It was in a housing policy from this ministry in 2012, before my appointment, 3 years before my appointment. It was in the foreword of the minister. When I called her, she said, well, she just didn't pay attention. She was under pressure when she signed. So that figure has no basis, but it has evolved from 17 million to 28 million. I saw that on your program yesterday morning. And I think we should disown these figures as a responsible nation. It has no authenticity. Now, are there deficits? There are. And my argument, and I stand to be challenged and corrected in a debate about this, is that the deficit is more prevalent in the urban centers. And I have challenged the National Population Commission to help us collect the data in this next census exercise. So let us just get that right, so that before we start trying to cook a large meal for an imaginary number of guests and waste our undertaking, let us understand what the real problems are. And so I think that our approach should first be that the states, especially the urban centers, must focus. They have, and in any event, this is a shared constitutional responsibility about housing. So, but the rental side, which is where there is more damage, is not being addressed, and the federal government has no responsibility there. The federal government has fiscal responsibility in cost of foreign exchange and all of those things, because they impact the cost of supply. So this is my response. In terms of access to finance, the Federal Mortgage Bank under this administration has reduced the threshold conditionalities for eligibility for people seeking mortgages of up to 5 million by removing the down payment requirement, the equity contribution of 10%. We removed it entirely. It's now zero. So you don't need an equity contribution to access that kind of loan. For those seeking to go 5 million and above, we've lowered it from 15% to 10%. And then we've also built in a rental scheme into all the housing estates we have built. As I speak, the Federal Mortgage Bank has delivered over 6,000 houses, FHA about 7,000. The National Housing Program that I spoke about across 35 states is about 5,000 to 6,000 units. But that is not the whole picture. That is not the Nigerian picture. It is the federal government picture so far under this administration. And then you have to look at the private sector, you have to look at the states.
Duly noted, Mr. Fashola, and you know, thank you for your insight on that. You did mention that we shouldn't begin to cook a large meal based on these numbers, and the census would give us a better understanding about the estimate. But since you're disputing that 28 million Nigerians, and what you met was 17.7, I believe. What would you say from what you've seen so far? What would you put the number at so that we have a better sense of where it might be?
First of all, I am not disputing what doesn't. I'm just telling you that it doesn't exist. If you have the figure and the basis for arriving at it, put it out and let us have a discussion about it. I am saying that the first figure that was in the public space, even when I was governor, was 17 million. When I became minister, I said, how did you arrive at it? I am here to solve problems, and in order to solve problems, I must probably diagnose and define the problems before I start implementing solutions. So if you tell me there was 17 million, how was it computed? I need to know. And if you want to stick to a figure that doesn't exist, I can't really stop you, but I'm saying that we should stop this. It's absolutely foolish because that figure doesn't exist. I don't know any nation that has a 17 million housing deficit. Please show me one. The person who signed the document in which he was, I've had a conversation with her, and she said, look, she signed without paying attention. It was an error. And we are owning that error and racing down to the bottom with it. I admit there are deficits. There are deficits in the urban centers because people leave their homes in the rural areas, they leave houses to come and squat or rent houses in the urban centers. Let's be scientific and understand that this is consistent with what the UN has told us, that more people are moving to cities in the last 50 years of human existence. That makes sense to me. How many are they? We need to do a census. That's what a serious nation does. Do a survey, enumerate and get the data, and then say, this is authentic and this is scientific. For those who still want to choose 17 million and then they have multiplied it to 20, I leave them alone. But it is not a persuasive argument to me as a problem solver.